Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I am your host of Killer Instinct. And before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well. And if you are looking for more exclusive Killer Instinct content, you can always find that over on our Patreon. We post an additional 3 exclusive episodes over on Patreon every single month, and also end the month with an exclusive live stream. All of the information for the Patreon can be found in the description box below, or if you're listening on Spotify, you can find those videos straight in the feed or at the top of the page. Now, with that all being said, let's jump into the reason we are here today, which is to talk about the tragic murder of Brian Barrett, also known as the Tall, Hot Blonde murders, for reasons you will soon understand. So, with that all being said, let's jump right on into it today. Brian Barrett was born on February 1st, 1984 in Williamsville, New York, to his parents, Daniel and Deborah Barrett. Brian grew up and attended Starpoint High School in Pendleton, New York, where he was a star athlete, specifically excelling in baseball. Those who knew Brian described him as a nice kid. He had a positive attitude. He was known to be a little bit more on the quiet side, but extremely kind-hearted nonetheless. After high school, Brian went to college at Buffalo State College, where he was studying to become a teacher, and he also worked part-time at a manufacturing company in Clarence, New York called Dynabrade Corporations. Now, outside of Brian's professional and academic life, Brian spent his free time assisting his father in coaching soccer, which was a win-win for him because it allowed Brian to do something that he loved dearly, which was spending time with his loved ones. Brian absolutely loved his family, and being able to coach this soccer team was something that was great for him because, again, not only did he get to spend quality time with his father, but he was also able to encourage young kids as well. Now, while Brian was working at Dynabrade, he met a coworker of his named Thomas Montgomery, and Thomas Montgomery is going to play a very key role in this case. Now, Thomas was born in 1959, and he also lived in Clarence, New York. When Thomas was younger, he served for the Marine Corps for 6 years, and for all things considered, those who knew him described him as an above average guy. After he left the Marines, he went on to get married. He had 2 daughters. He was the vice president of his daughter's swim club. He also taught at his Sunday school. His neighbors described him as being the kindest and nicest neighbor that they ever had. He was known as a very good man. Now, when him and Brian were co-workers, Thomas was working at Dynabrade as a machinist for the company. And when you take a look at Thomas's life, he was married, he had a family, he had a job. It seemed like he had a very nice, stable, and fulfilling life. But for Thomas, it wasn't enough. Thomas said that at this point in his life, he was missing something. There was a missing piece for him. He wasn't happy in his marriage. He wasn't super thrilled with his job. So because of this, he really turned to outside sources to fulfill these missing pieces for him. And he really started engaging in habits that are not the healthiest. And the first of these started with online gambling. Thomas made a profile to gamble online on a gambling website. He created a username that he went by and would chat in different chat rooms with the people that he was playing these games against. And for Thomas, the username that he used was Marine Sniper. He he used Marine Sniper as his username when talking to these other people online. And according to him, his favorite game to play on the websites was Texas Hold'em. Now, what very quickly followed with this online gambling was the online chat rooms that came within the gambling site. Thomas said that he felt a sense of freedom when speaking in these online chat rooms with other people because he could be whoever he wanted to be. He could really create a facade, a character. He could be who he wanted to be. He could say what he wanted to say, knowing that he was never going to have to actually see any of these people that he was communicating with. And for him, there was a sense of freedom in that. And one day, while Thomas was playing an online game of blackjack on this website as Marine Sniper, he began communicating and chatting with another player that would change the trajectory of Thomas's life forever. And that someone was a woman who went by the username Tall Hot Blonde. Now, Tall Hot Blonde revealed that her real name was Jessi, and in the first few exchanges of messages between Jessi and Thomas, Jessi actually confronted Thomas and told him that he was in the wrong chat room, and Thomas asked Jessi what she meant by that. He didn't know what she was referring to, and Jessi told Thomas that this was the room for the younger crowd, for the younger group of people that were playing, and Jessi told Thomas that she was 18 years old, to which Thomas very quickly responded saying that it was okay because he too was 18 years old, conveniently leaving out the part where Thomas's real age was 46. So now Thomas, who really was 46 years old, is pretending to be Marine Sniper and an 18-year-old boy. But Thomas's lie worked in his favor at the time because it meant that him and Jessi continued messaging. Jessi explained to Thomas that she was from a small town in West Virginia and came from a family of 4. She said that she had a brother and her 2 parents. Now, Thomas said that his messaging and the exchanges between Thomas and Jessi very quickly developed into a flirty relationship. They would describe each other physically. Jessi would send Thomas photos in her bathing suits. And again, 46-year-old Thomas pretended that he was a tall, muscular 18-year-old with specifically big shoulders. Thomas also told Jessi that he was heading off to boot camp for the military, and he also gave himself a new name, Tommy. So Jessi knew him as Tommy, the 18-year-old getting ready to go off to boot camp and join the military. And when Jessi would ask to see pictures of who she believed was Tommy, Thomas would send back pictures of himself in the Marines just 30 years prior. He also convinced Jessi that he could only talk on the phone late at night when he was quote unquote off duty, and afterwards told her that he was going to be serving in combat overseas in Iraq. And Jessi believed him. Now, the conversations, like I said, between Thomas and Jessi, it started out as friendship and then it developed into flirty, and over time it became very sexual. Jessi sent Thomas pairs of her underwear. They would have conversations about what they would do to each other when they would see each other. And Thomas self-admittedly said that these conversations with Jessi escalated into an all-consuming obsession. Thomas was not able to differentiate between fantasy and reality at a certain point in this, and he became obsessed with the idea of Jessi. He would stay online until 5, 6 in the morning, all hours of the night, talking online with Jessi, and then going to work that same morning at 7 a.m. According to Thomas, he said doing this made him feel like a kid again. There was an excitement about this that he was drawn into, whether that was an adrenaline rush from getting attention from someone who he thought would be unattainable, whether that was doing something wrong and knowing it was wrong, but the adrenaline rush of doing it anyways. Thomas had said that while talking to Jessi online, he was able to create the stories of the life that he wished he had. He felt like his life was not fulfilling. He felt mundane. He did not feel excited about the life that he was living, so he had to create this fantasy of what he wished it was. And even though Thomas swore that he was able to tell the difference between, like I said, fantasy and reality, his actions showed otherwise. As the affair between Thomas and Jessi ramped up, Thomas, who was going as Tommy, virtually asked Jessi to marry him, and she was thrilled. He told Jessi that they would get married when he returned home from Iraq, again, only amping up the feelings that were coming from this online relationship. And even more than that, on January 2nd, 2006, Thomas wrote a note to himself that he kept at his work. And this note I'm sharing with you because it really does go to show how Thomas blurred the lines between what was real and what wasn't. In this note, Thomas said, quote, "On January 2nd, 2006, Tom Montgomery, 46 years old, ceases to exist and is replaced by an 18-year-old battle-scarred Marine. All paperwork is set. He is strong, good-looking. He has money in the bank, $2.5 million. He's handsome, like a red-headed Harrison Ford." End quote. Now, obviously, when reading this is a clear-cut example of how Thomas is not able to really understand what he's doing here. There's a difference. It's not black and white anymore. It is now completely gray. He is now convincing not just Jessi, but himself that he is Tommy. But all of this really came to a halt when Thomas's wife, Cindy, discovered a package of underwear that Jessi had sent Thomas. Cindy confronted Thomas at this time, who confessed to the affair. And Cindy at this point was preparing for a divorce, but not without letting Jessi know exactly who she was dealing with. When Cindy learned that Jessi was an 18-year-old girl, she felt an obligation to warn Jessi about the dangers of online dating and talking to strangers on the internet. She ended up writing Jessi a letter, and in it she wrote, quote, "Jessi, enclosed you will find a picture of my family. Let me introduce you to these people. The man in the center is Tom, my husband. There is no Tommy. He is taking advantage of you. You need to be much more cautious with your safety. You will only be hurt by a man who has mastered the art of manipulation and lies. Do not trust words on a computer." End quote. So at this point, the gig was up and Thomas's real identity was revealed. And from Jessi's perspective, when she read this letter, she was heartbroken. She was shocked that this man that she thought she was going to marry turned out to be someone completely different. So she ended up going right back where she started, which was the online gambling chat rooms. And through these chat rooms, she sought comfort in someone else. And that someone else was Brian Barrett, Thomas's coworker. Now, Brian was also on these online gambling websites, and he was going by the username Beefcake. After Thomas's identity had been revealed, Jessi reached out to Brian and initially was doing so to get more information on Thomas. She almost wanted to use Brian to fill in the blanks of who she thought Tommy was. She thought Brian would be able to give her more answers and more of the truth. And so through this, Brian and Jessi began talking. And similarly to her relationship with Thomas, what started off as an online friendship very quickly turned into a flirtationship and then very, very sexual. But what Brian thought was his new romantic interest, Jessi, on the other hand, again, was only using Brian as her way to get back at Tommy, this quote unquote Tommy that she still had feelings for, even though Tommy didn't exist. Jessi told Brian all about Tommy, all about what the real Thomas did and the lies that he told. And through this, Brian and Jessi really joined forces in a way, and they went against Thomas. They would find Thomas in the other chat rooms on this website, and they would harass him by calling him a loser and a predator, so much so that Thomas ended up getting suspended from the website because people were pinning him as someone who was potentially harmful and dangerous. But a lot of that taunting then turned into in person because because Brian and Thomas, again, they were coworkers. They had to see each other at work day in and day out. And Brian began telling the other coworkers at the company about Thomas's catfishing, which obviously caused for public humiliation, really. And all of this was fueled by Jessi, because Jessi was asking Brian to do these things. She was asking him to say these things to either Thomas or coworkers or join him in the other chat rooms. But over time, Brian himself was also getting tired of these games. He thought, it was funny in the beginning, but over time, it just got a little bit tiring and played out. But that was until Jessi stepped things up a notch again, and she asked Brian to meet her in person. Now, when Thomas learned that Brian and Jessi were going to meet, he was less than thrilled. As you can imagine, there was now a love triangle between Thomas and Brian and Jessi. And Thomas was extremely upset about Brian and Jessi's relationship. He ended up texting Brian saying that he was upset that Brian would choose Jessi over their friendship, to which Brian responded saying that he didn't understand why his relationship or his situationship, for a lack of a better word, with Jessi would bother Thomas so much, considering the age difference between Jessi and Thomas, and also considering the fact that Brian and Thomas weren't necessarily the closest of friends either. But this meeting actually never ended up happening between Brian and Jessi, because Jessi called off the meeting on the day of. But again, even the sheer idea of Jessi and Brian meeting sent Thomas into an absolute spiral. He ended up messaging Jessi, cursing her out for everything she had done with Brian and all the conversations and the talking that she was doing with Brian. And despite knowing the truth about Thomas's real identity, despite knowing that Tommy wasn't real, Jessi was still attached to Thomas, and it didn't seem to matter that he wasn't who he said he was originally. She wanted Tommy to still exist, and she knew that Thomas was her only connection to this character, to this Tommy character. Tommy didn't exist without Thomas. And so because of this, the two talked through it, and Thomas and Jessi agreed to start over as friends. And through this, Thomas began confiding in Jessi about his utter disdain for Brian. Some of the messages that Thomas sent Jessi regarding Brian said that Brian, quote, lost a very good friend, and that he made a very deadly enemy, end quote. He also told Jessi that she made his heart ice cold, and that when it comes to Brian, he hates him with a passion, and for 10 cents, he would eliminate him. He also went as far to say, as Brian will pay in blood. Now, these are pretty intense messages, and you might think that these messages would scare Jessi away or make her uncomfortable or make her think at least twice about continuing to talk to Thomas. However, weirdly enough, it only drew her in further. Thomas and Jessi started up their sexual relationship again. However, Thomas was crushed when he learned that he was not the only one Jessi was talking to, and that Jessi was also talking to other men as well, outside of Thomas and Brian. Thomas ended up taking this so harshly, he actually told Jessi that if she did not leave him alone, that he was going to physically hurt her and her family. Now, this threat did cause Jessi to take a step back and give it some breathing room for some time. However, she did come back, and the two began talking again. But around the time that Jessi started up conversations with Thomas again, she also was creeping her way back into Brian's life at this time. And when Thomas found this out, because he saw Brian's name on Jessi's MySpace page, Thomas went into a complete mental breakdown. So much so that Jessi actually warned Brian. So it had now reached a point where Jessi was concerned enough to tell Brian about how much this had affected Thomas and her fear over what Thomas could do to him. Jessi messaged Thomas saying, quote, I just want to tell you, I have totally pissed Thomas off, and he has it in his head that you and I are still together, end quote. Brian went on to say that he wasn't too worried, but he was going to keep his distance from Thomas at work. He did mention that Thomas did try and hit him in the parking lot with his car, and he did agree that Thomas seemed to be unpredictable. However, he didn't seem overly concerned. Again, at this point, Brian was 22 years old, Thomas was 46. Brian wasn't thinking that Thomas was this dangerous man or that Thomas could do something to harm Brian. It just wasn't at the top of his mind. Now, at this point, Thomas began consistently harassing Jessi. But over time, this love triangle between Jessi and Brian and Thomas, it only snowballed for Thomas and made things worse in his mind, and his behavior began escalating. What started out as just rude messages or off-putting messages or threatening messages escalated into harassment, full-on threats, and also very racist messages towards Jessi, which caused Jessi to completely back off from Thomas. But again, not getting a response from Jessi was only fueling Thomas's fire. And then on Friday, September 15th, 2006, when Brian was leaving work at 10 p.m., he left the building and walked towards his truck, which was parked in the back of the parking lot. Once Brian got into his car and was sitting in the driver's seat, someone approached him from behind and shot Brian 3 times in the neck and left arm. Now, on this particular weekend, Brian had no weekend plans, and so because no one knew that he was still at work, no one reported him missing. Brian wasn't supposed to see anyone that weekend. He wasn't scheduled with anything, so no one was made aware that he was missing at that point. And Brian's body was left there for the remainder of the weekend until Sunday, when a coworker of Brian's, a different coworker of Brian's, discovered Brian's body slumped over in his truck, covered in blood, and immediately contacted authorities. Now, when police arrived on the scene, one of the first things they noticed was how calculated this murder was, and this seemed very personal because whoever did this to Brian had also taken the time to slash Brian's tires, leaving him helpless after he had been shot. The police actually described it as leaving Brian as a sitting duck because there was nothing he could do. Now, immediately upon launching this investigation, authorities knew right away to look into Thomas because coworkers of Thomas and Brian explained to police about the conflict that the two of them had with each other. Now, police also learned at this point about Jessi, and they learned more about this online love triangle. So with this new information, they knew that it was pivotal for them to A, locate Thomas, and B, locate Jessi, because they were worried for Jessi's safety. They thought it was very possible that if Thomas did this to Brian, he very easily could be after Jessi as well. Now, outside of just the circumstantial evidence of the coworkers telling police about this conflict, other physical evidence that pointed to Thomas was a peach pit that was found right by Brian's truck that had Thomas's DNA on it, as well as a gun clip left right by the truck as well that belonged to Thomas Montgomery. Police were able to locate Jessi's MySpace profile, and through that they were able to find her address in West Virginia, and police had dispatched out to her home to locate her and do a wellness check on her. Now, when the police arrived to Jessi's home and they knocked on the door, there was a woman who answered. This woman identified herself as Mary Schuyler, and immediately police asked Mary if she knew anyone by the name of Jessi, and Mary did. Jessi was Mary's daughter. However, Mary explained that Jessi didn't live at home. She actually lived in Concord, West Virginia at the time, and at this point, police asked Mary to call her daughter because they wanted to be able to ensure that Jessi was safe and they needed to talk to her. But to police's surprise, Mary explained that she had no way of getting in contact with with her own daughter. Now, police were a little thrown off by this, considering it was strange that she wasn't able to get in contact again with her own daughter with the circumstance. If police showed up to your door saying that they were concerned for your daughter's safety, why would you not be able to get in contact with her? Now, it was at this point that Mary was very visibly uncomfortable, and so police continued pressing Mary to try and figure out where Jessi was. They just felt that something was off. And finally, Mary cracked and told police the unimaginable. Mary told authorities that she was Jessi. Mary went on to say that she had been catfishing men using her own daughter's name and pictures. She was the one who was sending these men lingerie, pictures of her own daughter in bathing suits, sexting these men over the internet, posing as her daughter, Jessi, who, mind you, was a teenager. Jessi was still a teenager at this point. And Jessi, this character that Mary created, even though Jessi was real, Jessi had nothing to do with any of this. This was all Mary's own calculated doing. Now, in a weird way, when you think about it, Thomas and Mary, they were both lying to each other the whole time. Thomas was lying, saying that he was Tommy, and Mary was lying, saying that she was her daughter, Jessi. And Mary was also simultaneously lying to Brian. Now, at this point, after confessing that she was the one behind the Jessi accounts, Mary was willing to fill out a police report. She told authorities that she knew that something bad was going to happen because on Friday night, Thomas had called her saying that her quote-unquote boyfriend was easy to take care of, which Mary knew. With that being said, something bad had happened. Now, at this point, police were very quickly able to locate Thomas. Thomas was at his home, and Thomas was brought down to the police station for questioning, and he completely denied having any involvement in this case. He denied the murder. He denied anything that had to do with Brian. He denied all of it. So at this point, police obtained a warrant to search through Thomas's home and to obtain his electronics. Now, findings in the home included ammunition that was the exact match to the shell casings that were found at the scene. And these shell casings and this ammunition, it was very specific. These belonged to an old military rifle that Thomas was known to have. Thomas did own this gun. And even though police were not able to locate the murder weapon itself, there was actually a picture that was taken not too long prior to the murder at Thomas's house. And in the background of the picture was the specific gun. Because of the circumstantial evidence with the love triangle, because of the other physical evidence being the peach pit at the scene and the gun clip, Thomas was arrested on November 27th, 2006. And at the time of his arrest, Thomas was actually not made aware that Jessi was a middle-aged woman. He actually didn't find out about the identity of Jessi until after his arrest. So you can imagine his surprise when he learned the news. Now, Thomas pled not guilty initially, and he wanted the case to go to trial. He claimed that he had an alibi for the night of the murder. He said that on September 15th, he was at home. However, his wife, Cindy, quickly shot this down. She claimed that Thomas was in fact not home on the night of the murder, leaving his whereabouts unaccounted for. So because of this, after speaking to his lawyer, Thomas decided that the best thing to do would be to take a plea deal. And on August 29th, 2007, Thomas pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter for the murder of Brian Barrett, and he was sentenced to only 20 years in prison. Now, Mary was never criminally charged either, and we're about to get into Mary in a second and deep dive on her. But I do want to say regarding Thomas and his sentencing, there was not, and there still isn't that much public information regarding his sentence and what really is happening today with it. However, I did some deep digging into his inmate profile, and I discovered that he was released in 2024 on parole. So it is believed that Thomas is released. I can't say that with complete certainty. However, I am confident enough to tell you that based off of the reports and findings that I discovered. So just take that with what you will. But he was only sentenced to 20 years, which would make sense. If he was sentenced to 20 years, he would be released. However, his whereabouts after that are unknown. Now, despite this being Brian's case, really, despite Brian being the person whose life was so senselessly lost in this case, I feel like this case really does tend to get overshadowed with the shock factor of it. And really, we talk about, Jessi and Thomas and this love triangle and all of the adrenaline and all of the shock that comes with that. But what we have to remember at the core of this is that Brian is the victim here. Brian lost his life over this. And after his murder, Brian's parents were very vocal in stating that they wished that there was a law that could somehow implicate Mary criminally in this case. They wanted her to be held accountable for what she did because she was the common denominator in all of this. Mary was the one who was really orchestrating and fueling this fire, even though Thomas definitely made the decision and he was the one that took it to the next level. Mary was very involved in this as well. Now, Mary's ex-husband named Tim, who was married to Mary at that time, he was interviewed in 2009. And he stated that at the time, he did not believe that Mary was remorseful at all for her part in this case. He also said that even after Thomas's arrest, she did not tell her family about what was going on. Mary kept such a secret, hidden second life that she did not tell anyone about what was happening regarding Brian's case. It wasn't until she went to testify at Thomas's arraignment that she even told Tim what was going on. And even then, she very much downplayed it. She told Tim that she did something bad and that she had been talking to someone online who had a quote unquote mental problem. And she was also talking to that man's friend. And she explained the two of them were coworkers, and the one who struggled mentally got jealous and killed the other. Now, Tim was in shock just from hearing that. So imagine how he felt when he heard even more details about it. And again, Mary just downplayed this entirely. She said that all she was having was surface level conversations with both men. That was it. And Tim said that he was absolutely disgusted when he learned that Mary was using their own daughter as really a pawn in all of this, using her name, using her pictures, sending that so freely out there was incredibly, incredibly disturbing. And it was actually Jessi who learned of this information before Tim even did. After Mary testified at the arraignment, people started to talk in the town. There started to be some chatter, and Jessi Googled her mom's name. And that is when she learned about what her mom had done. And she took that information and she confronted her father, Tim, with it, who was just as floored and, like I said, disgusted. And that was the first time he had ever heard of it. Tim said that up until that point, he thought that he had a good marriage. He said that there was no indication for him to think that anything like this was ever going on. Now, Tim did say that Mary was very glued to the computer. She loved her computer games, but he thought that that was the extent of it. He thought it was just that. Tim said that there was a long-standing joke in Mary's family growing up that she was a compulsive liar, and that when she would get in trouble, she would pretend to cry. She was very good at faking sympathy and faking emotions when she felt a state of panic. So there were little things here and there that when Tim looks back, the dots kind of piece themselves together. However, he could have never imagined that this would have been the outcome. Tim also stated that he believes without a shadow of a doubt that Mary should be criminally charged, and that it would have possibly been the only thing to keep her accountable or to make her feel held accountable, because all she really got is a few stares and a slap on the wrist from society saying, "What did you just do?" And then she was on her merry way. Now, as far as Jessi, at the time that this had happened, she cut off all communications with her mother, and there is no update. We don't need an update, but that is what occurred after this case. And as for Mary, she was also interviewed 6 months after Thomas was sentenced to his 20 years, and she stated that she never meant for any of this to happen. She was bored and she was lonely. She was just trying to be a good mom for her kids, but her kids were going off to college, and she felt like she was alone, and she was just trying to have some fun online. But things only got worse when police looked through Mary's laptop and discovered hundreds of more pictures of Jessi, all seemingly taken without Jessi's knowledge. And it turns out Mary was sending these pictures of her daughter to countless other men, not just Thomas and Brian. Now, Brian's murder took place in 2006, and the internet was a much different place back then. And while there were never any laws made to enhance internet safety after Brian's murder and in Brian's honor, it definitely started a conversation that was not being had at that point regarding the consequences of what the internet can create, which was not something that people were really taking into consideration at that time. But with that being said, you guys, that is this case. That is the horrible murder of Brian Barrett. That is the twisted love triangle of Brian and Thomas and Jessi and Mary and all of it. I don't know about you guys. I wholeheartedly believe that Mary should have been held criminally responsible in this case. Police did try to see if there was a way to get her for accomplice in a murder. However, criminally and logistically and technically, there really was nothing to tie her to the murder itself. So let me know what you have to say about this case. But with that being said, you guys, it's going to be all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. Make sure before you leave, you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly, like I said, every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. All the links you can find in the description box below, including Patreon. And with that being said, you guys, I will be back next week with a brand new one. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.